Modern day Britain is a far cry from its world conquering past. The birthplace of industrialisation has endured a slow and dramatic decline since the end of World War II. If you take a wander around any medium-sized British town nowadays, it's a grim task. There's empty shop units, there's a clear rise in homelessness, unemployment, there's open drug use and a general feeling of what's the point? Many commentators sensationalise the state of Britain for clicks, looking for easy targets and feeding into populist narratives about who's to blame. Some of them even go so far as to film themselves walking around once proud post-industrial towns and cities, pointing at scenes of decay and destitution. And it could be argued that this is simply an act of them adding to the public record, but it's always left me asking, well, how did this happen, and what can be done about it? So I want to take a look back at how I feel we got here. We all know something's wrong. Your politics don't matter. We can all agree that things have gotten noticeably worse. We have that in common. So, if you will, let's humour each other. We could go as far back as the beginning of the 1900s, and I think we could draw a convincing line from then to now. But for the sake of brevity, let's start with one event that I think is as good as any. When we search for answers as to how we got here, it's common to hear people in the UK point to the election of Margaret Thatcher in May 1979. However, I think people overlook the events leading up to her election and how they eroded trust in politics amongst the working class. James Callaghan was elected as a Labour Prime Minister in 1976, making him only the third ever Labour Prime Minister and leader of only the fourth UK Labour government. British politics has always largely revolved around the Conservative Party, a centre-right party with an emphasis on sticking to tradition. It's a party filled to the brim with landowners and moneyed families. Labour was established as the opposite of this, as a working class alternative off the back of Keir Hardie's work during the miners' strikes of the late 1800s. In the 1800s and early 1900s, British politics were changing. The Reform Acts of the 1800s had given most working class men the vote, and there was an appetite for change. Hardie advocated for a non-Marxist, Christian-centric social democracy. Hardie's ideological vision for the party would be open to interpretation by subsequent leaders. Callaghan was elected during a time of ideological infighting within the Labour Party. The question of how socialist is socialist enough was a frequent thorn in the party's side. Some argued that nationalisation didn't matter. The government had enough control over industry as it was, and some wanted full nationalisation. In a bid to control inflation, Callaghan had enacted limits on the rate of pay, which infuriated the Trade Union Congress. This led to mass strikes during the coldest winter the country had seen in 16 years, and severe storms during this time crippled remote parts of the country. Faith in Labour was fading fast. Callaghan had set a 5% pay increase limit on public sector workers and urged the private sector to follow suit. In late 1978, striking workers at a Ford factory settled a 17% increase. Following this, strikes occurred in other industries, from gravediggers and refuge collectors to NHS staff. Many of them felt that the only way to get what they deserved was to take things into their own hands and bypass the Callaghan government completely. Callaghan publicly denied there was a crisis. Thatcher saw her opportunity. She acknowledged the crisis publicly. Workers were taking action at a grassroots level and were being dismissed by the party that was set up to help them with their exact predicament. The opposition, the Tories, the party associated with disdain for the masses, glimpsed a way back in. Callaghan was eventually ousted in a no-confidence vote in 1979, and this obviously paved the way for a Thatcher electoral victory. The party of the working class had fallen. Thatcher was Callaghan's ideological opposite. The Labour Party's failure to enact a politics that truly worked for the masses must have been music to Thatcher's ears. Thatcher's often remembered for the contentious remark, "There is no such thing as society," a remark that many people feel embodies her politics. It's a remark that emphasises the role of the individual in the family as opposed to society as a whole. If you do good things as an individual, work hard and long, focus on your family and yourself, then life outside of your bubble will surely improve. Callaghan's failures allowed Thatcher to dress up everything from bog standard Tory policy straight through to downright disdain for the masses as pragmatism. She knew that anything mildly socialistic could be dismissed as having been tried and failed by the previous government. And this allowed her to take severe action when she felt it was needed. Economically, Thatcher was what many would call a neoliberal or a corporatist. Neoliberalism is a simple idea that there should be less reliance on the state and that ultimately everything should go through and be determined by the free market. It's been suggested that she was a huge admirer of Friedrich Hayek. It's a man that many would call the father of neoliberalism. A man that initially began his ideological journey as a socialist before ending up as a staunch advocate of free markets. Neoliberalism might also sometimes be called trickle-down economics. Across the pond in the US, you'll often hear this referred to as Reaganomics. Reagan was an admirer of Hayek. He was even photographed with a copy of Milton Friedman's book Capitalism and Freedom. And Friedman belonged to the same circles as Hayek and was massively influenced by him during his time at the Chicago School of Economics. Thatcher and Reagan are often viewed in the same light for a reason. They're ideological bedfellows. The mantra was simple: let the rich play and eventually all of the good that we do will trickle down to you. The working class was truly out in the cold by the time Thatcher started enacting her will in the UK. And it could be said that Britain's housing crisis began with Thatcher's Right to Buy scheme. This involved council tenants being allowed to buy their homes at a significant discount, and that allowed them to climb the property ladder. And it's a noble idea, in essence, that reflected Thatcher's vision of a competent individual and their family. Millions of people bought their homes through this scheme. However, the housing stock was never topped up, and that's left many people stuck renting. Councils were also not obliged to reinvest the money made from sales in their housing stock, and the UK housing market has never truly recovered. It turns out society does exist, Thatcher just couldn't see it. Britain's post-industrial decline was cemented during the miners' strikes of 1984 and 1985. Thatcher had claimed that the mines were uneconomic and that nuclear power was on the way to save the day. Many of the mines were nationalised, and these mines were the heartbeat of working life in many British towns. The miners thought hard, but the towns were left gutted and deindustrialised by the closures, which then led to mass unemployment. And the legacy of these closures is still very apparent today if you take a walk around any former mining town. As well as utilising Callaghan's failures, she was well aware of events in the Soviet Union and other communist blocs, and she would invoke these any time she really wanted to paint a picture of how bad a culture dependent on the state would look. She was the pragmatist and everyone else was a simpleton. Thatcher played a key role in establishing the modern political paradigm of the individual as a self-serving unit. Now, bear in mind, this is the woman who, as Education Secretary in 1971, cancelled free milk for school children as she thought it was economically unviable. Fast forward a little bit, and Thatcher resigns in November 1990. Despite Thatcher's exit, the Tories remain in power until 1997 under the leadership of John Major. The 90s were a time of great change, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. There was a consensus that Western values had won out over the forces of communism and dictatorship. Capitalism was the way to go, and it seemed obvious to everyone. Francis Fukuyama, the American political scientist, even went so far as to label the events of the early 90s as the end of history. All other ideologies had been defeated. Liberalism was the natural order of things. There would be no more conflict, no more strife. Capitalism gives us everything we need. It's the only way of accruing aggregate wealth and meeting the demands of the masses. The technology that we see everywhere today began to take hold in the 90s, the internet, mobile phones especially. I like to think of the 90s as a more innocent version of the time we're currently living in. The benefits of the technology that we use today, minus the algorithmic chaos and their plutocratic overlords, were obvious. Today they've become something else, something far more sinister. To some extent, the romantic notion of the 90s feels valid to me. In 1997, the Labour Party regained power in a landslide election victory after 18 years of Tory rule. However, it wasn't the Labour from the Callaghan era, this was New Labour. A deliberate rebranding had taken place. It was a conscious bid to wipe the slate clean. The winter of discontent was a Labour issue. This was New Labour. It's a shiny, pragmatic party that would take the UK into the new millennium. This was a new party in more than just an aesthetic sense though. Tony Blair removed a key clause from the party's manifesto in 1995. Clause 4 aimed to nationalise industry and had been part of the party manifesto since 1918. Now that's a major change that sought to embrace market forces. It was a nod to the new order of things. This was Labour light. The party had embraced elements of Thatcherism. The public couldn't be trusted to run their own affairs. Callaghan had shown this in his failures and Thatcher had gotten the optics right. It was as Fukuyama had said, there is only one ideology now. New Labour arguably did a lot of good. They introduced a national minimum wage, devolution, the Human Rights Act, and they increased funding for the NHS and education. But the ideological shift was there. Neoliberalism and Adam Smith's invisible hand would determine the material quality of your working day and your income. If the market was down, you were down. Advocates for neoliberalism like to talk about the nanny state, the overbearing government. I feel like not enough is said about the impact of corporate life on the working and middle classes. We all know that to find work you have to essentially run between massive conglomerate corporations looking for work. You get the job and you know you're replaceable. Fordism is over, the idea of a job for life is over. The market will decide if you're competent, if you're needed, if you're worth the wage. Society is very real. We feel its absence in the destitution of our town centres. Our care for the commons is visibly diminished and we've given ourselves over to HR departments and endless commutes. Some sort of public ownership is required. Some sort of safety net is required. You don't need to be a socialist to want to live in a healthy society. Both the individual and the society can live in harmony. A society that cares for the individual is possible. Tony Blair's New Labour would go on to win further landslide victories in 2001 and 2005. In 2003, Blair's government would go on to participate in the illegal invasion of Iraq, a conflict that resulted in at least 1 million deaths, and quite rightly, Blair is regarded as a war criminal in many quarters and is often referred to as a lapdog of US imperialism. Many people still regard the war as a conquest for oil. As the 2000s progressed, things were about to get much worse. The trickle-down of wealth that we'd all been promised had been slow in appearing, and anyone naive enough to think that it would was about to get a nasty wake-up call. Globalisation had begun at pace, and for those of you unaware, globalisation is the act of sending production abroad. So, for example, British businesses may want to employ cheaper labour but are prohibited by the national minimum wage. So to source cheap labour, they set up factories abroad, paying staff pennies a day, then having the goods that they produce there shipped back to their target market. So let's be clear here, the primary way of gaining employment in the UK, namely applying for work at a corporation, is being stripped away because employers don't want to pay your wages. The market has decided that it wants cheaper labour. You as an individual will just have to make do as your options vanish. Towns that were already gutted by mine closures under Thatcher suffered even further. Many British towns had thrived in textile industries, but these were all gone. They weren't stolen, they were shipped abroad by their owners so that children could make clothing in Dickensian conditions. You're then sold those clothes at an incredibly inflated price, the company keeps the profit. This is what the market has decided. Former mining towns now sport no industries other than retail. Sites that once housed mines, textile factories and breweries are now occupied by massive 24-hour supermarkets that sell you everything that you need. The inherent cycle of production and consumption has vanished. You can consume but not produce. This is what the market has decided. Politics has taken a back seat. Just relax and enjoy the ride. Neoliberal ideology would come to head in 2007 and 2008 with the global financial crisis. It's a crisis built on the sale of subprime mortgages that were sold to people who weren't ever going to be able to pay them off. And if they could, it would take them decades. Now, when a bank gives someone a loan, the bank immediately updates the system to reflect how much they will make once the loan is paid back. This doesn't happen when the loan is paid back in full, it happens immediately. If a bank gives you a £10,000 loan and expects to make the £10,000 plus £5,000 of interest, then their systems immediately add £15,000 to their balance books. The bank has made £15,000 in that moment. The money doesn't exist, but they can spend it as if it does. Banks invest and spend their money as any company would, except this money never existed. This dovetailed into a massive global financial crisis consisting of bank runs and millions of people losing their homes. This is what the market has decided. In the ultimate insult, the banks were bailed out by governments. Not a single home owner was saved. It seems that when the going gets tough for private enterprise, state safety nets are okay. God forbid this should apply to us plebs. In 2010, the UK elected a coalition Conservative and Liberal Democrat government. The primary focus of this government was its austerity programme. Austerity was designed as a response to the financial crisis. Its primary goal was a reduction of public spending as a means of dealing with the budget deficit brought about by the financial crisis. The masses were being shafted again. The impact was profound. Instead of dealing with criminals in the banking sector in the same way as somewhere like Iceland had, the UK public were to shoulder the burden of one of the most impactful events of the 21st century. Already struggling high streets crumbled throughout the 2010s, online shopping had become commonplace. Why visit town centres when you can get everything you need from Amazon? Why care about lack of opportunities if you're managing to scrape by? Finance capitalism was on the rise. Can't afford to buy something that you really want or need? Bright House, cash converters and many other predatory chain stores started to fill British high streets. Finance allows you to get what you want whilst allowing companies to charge you more over a long period of time. You get what you want, but they get more. This is what the market had decided. You will adjust and you'll be proud of your meagre means. It's 2026 as I make this video, and to this day the same problems persist. Austerity is materially evident everywhere. It seems 16 years and counting hasn't been enough for the market to correct course. The invisible hand must have passed us by. The current mood in the UK is one of misery and resignation. Why aren't we doing anything about it, and who can we turn to for ideas? I think it's fair to say that many of us, especially those in Gen Z, have grown up in what we might call a media landscape as opposed to a culture. As a species, we've arguably reached the natural outcome of our evolution. We can feed and shelter ourselves en masse. We've unlocked the resources offered to us by the commons and put them to great use. Arguably, there's not much left to do but continue wondering what it's all about. We're animals. Sustenance and shelter are always going to be of primary concern, but What makes modern life different is that despite being animals, the vast majority of us no longer have to forage in nature. Our basic needs are met via a vast network of intertwined industries, and for most people it's hard to imagine where the food in their plate comes from. Our first thought would probably be the supermarket. Many of us have no connection to nature, and despite still having to toil for less than we deserve, we have more time in our hands than we know what to do with. That free time is happily filled by the entertainment industry. We're so immersed in fictional worlds and pseudo-events that many people now view their media consumption as their identity. We're all gamers, sports fans, film buffs, and that band's biggest fan. And don't get me wrong, I love my entertainment and could bore you senseless when it comes to my hobbies, but for me, these hobbies are part of my life, not its entirety. The problem is so profound that media consumption has become the front line of political discourse. Both the left and the right have been infected by what Neil Postman calls the technopoly. He would also argue that we're amusing ourselves to death. We're letting material reality pass us by in favour of synthetic realms. The mainstream left as a force has been severely neutered. Leftist politics are built on the idea of anti-imperialism, community, equality and workers' rights. Attempts to alter material reality for the better have been brushed aside in favour of media critique and symbolism. And it's not hard to see why. Even the left's attention has been stolen by corporate media. In a world that can be as grim as ours, it's not difficult to understand why people gravitate towards curated digital environments. Time spent in these synthetic worlds fosters symbols as opposed to action, and the problem with trading in symbolism is that anyone can come along and adopt these symbols and claim to be on your side, and instead of doing the reading or having real world conversations, we've been infected by TikTok stats and social media campaigns dressed up as activism. We can see this in the corporate world too, the main function of marketing is to make a company feel like your friend, to foster trust in the hope that you'll shop with them and feel good about it. Companies want you to view them as a person, hence why they'll happily adapt symbols that appeal to you. They'll do anything to appear moral. The pride flag in that huge supermarket chain isn't there because they care, it's because someone in marketing thought it would create a certain perception. If pride flags were banned tomorrow, none of these companies would hesitate to take them down. Companies aren't your friends. Media creators aren't your friend. They'll show you what you want to see if it means you'll buy what they're selling. The mainstream right suffers from this too, with social media platforms and legacy media filled to the brim with scathing diatribes about the impact of pride flags and trans ideology. Right-wing authors and personalities whine about being cancelled whilst selling books by the millions. Some of them, like Russell Brand, will nosedive into religion in a perfunctory attempt to maintain an audience. The right is drowning in labels and symbols much like the left is. I've always laughed at the right's suggestion that the UK has some sort of leftist government or media class. The UK has by and large been an institution administered by the moneyed and the landed. Anyone claiming the UK government and media class is leftist simply doesn't understand traditional leftist thinking. The right have swallowed the lie that the symbols the corporate world has adopted are legitimate. Everything is a conspiracy when you don't know how anything works. And it's a trite point to make, but we need to have more conversations. Conversation has died. It's okay to speak to someone you disagree with. It's okay to hear ideas that make you uncomfortable. The British working class needs to be united again. If you're a leftist, be aware that working class right-wingers can see the country is falling apart, much like you can. But they've been sold the lie that migration is to blame. Instead of blaming big business, they blame who they're told to blame. If you're on the right, be aware that leftist politics in the traditional sense, not the terminally online type, revolve around emancipating the working class, and you're part of that. Socialism exists out with Marxism and communism. There is common ground here. Western culture died a long time ago. It wasn't stolen by migrants, it was run into the ground by big business. The war in the West comes from within. Adam Smith would not approve of the capitalism we have today. For him, it had the potential to be incredibly compassionate, lifting people out of destitution through work, and he'd be incredibly disappointed at what it's become.